Hi, this is Jay. I'm an architect and I studied at the Kamla Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies. I finished my architecture about last year and I'm currently working at Samira Rathod Design Associates as a junior architect, and the editor is paid, which is her research wing in the office. And yeah, I mean, that's more or less who I am. And actually I'm here to talk about my thesis, which is called The Garden of Reconciliation, and it basically is placed in Kashmir, which is a very integral part of India, which a lot of people would agree to. And I think one reason that kind of helped me select this topic is that a couple of years ago, say about in 2009, I went for an exchange called the Seeds of Peace, which is an exchange where a lot of kids from, say, disputed areas are called, who are expected to stay together for about 28 days, do all the activities together, but at the same time talk about things that we usually would not talk about in a country like this, which is the conflict. And having met a couple of Pakistanis, Afghans, Americans, Palestinians, Jordanians there, one realizes that the other side definitely has a face. So no matter how much we keep fighting with Pakistan about this little part of our country called Kashmir, at the end they too have a face. And that's when I realized that, you know, Kashmir was a very, very important topic of debate between everybody that came from respective countries. And then in the fifth year, when I was doing my thesis, that's when I actually got a chance of looking at this region of conflict and seeing what, say, an architect or architecture itself could do in a region like this to make lives of people better, because we've seen so many people suffering, say almost the entire population of Kashmir suffering because of the ongoing conflict. And one would be extremely surprised to know that although this conflict that we imagine started in 1947 post the partition and independence, and we think that the conflict almost started because India and Pakistan were separated, has actually seen to have roots back a century back in 1846, when the Dogra king was appointed as the sole kind of monarch of this region, and the British kind of handed over such a large province of Jammu and Kashmir to him, which was initially kind of ruled over by a lot of different monarchs, because of which it was easier to kind of take care of the population, the needs, the aspirations of the people that lived in that area. But because of say one monarch that was then appointed for the whole region, which led to the territorialization of the sovereignty, it became very difficult for people to kind of then voice their opinions, because of which a lot of people kind of felt left out. A lot of the population's needs weren't met. And I think that's when the conflict really began between the people that stayed in Kashmir and the monarch, and then that just got aggravated because of the partition and the kind of promises that were made at that time. So it really was important for me to kind of read through all of this, which is why it took me very, very long to be convinced myself that I wanted to work with something like this, because one realizes that Kashmir and Srinagar, or the conflict for that matter right now, is a very, very kind of delicate political space within the country, which everybody has opinions about, but it's very difficult to voice these sort of opinions out in public. So it took me a lot of time to convince myself that I wanted to do this, and I think finally, because of the compassion I had, I took it up and I went to Srinagar to kind of get to know what the ground reality was. So one actually realizes that when you go to Kashmir, the whole city of Kashmir is incredibly tenacious, very beautiful, the people are extremely warm. And talking about the geographical aspects of the city, obviously it lies in the valley of Kashmir, which is why the weather is extremely pleasant there. So I really enjoyed my time there. And the city actually is divided into three very, very distinct zones. So one, which is, say, along the north of the city, is where the Dal Lake is. Right below that you have the whole market precinct, which we call the Lal Chowk, which also is the economic center of the city. And in between those, and kind of also encircling some of the market region, is where the downtown is, where most of the population of the kind of city resides. And this population mainly depends on farming for their daily bread, or our cheap labor that kind of works in the region around. So it's not very economically developed as a city, but it's incredibly beautiful. And the downtown region is actually something that, you know, one would not usually visit when you visit Srinagar. So those are parts of the cities that mostly people haven't seen, because it's only the boulevard which is around the Dal Lake or the Lal Chowk maximum that tourists are even allowed in. So it was a great opportunity for me to not only look for what I wanted to do in Kashmir, but also look at parts of Kashmir that haven't been explored before at all, which is why it was very important for me to go there and see what the reality and what people's lives were like. And when you travel in downtown, you realize what the architecture of that place is like, how people live, what kind of harmony is there that exists in the region, which none of us usually know about. Even the way the whole city and like the whole downtown area has been structured, so you will see like small lanes that are flanked by beautifully wooden crafted houses on either sides, and then you have the Jhelum that kind of cuts through downtown, so you always are walking along the river. And things like those. So, you know, it's a very, very beautiful region. And I think when I visited there for the first time, I was sure that I was doing my thesis here. I think one of the most important questions that kind of was always at the back of my head is, what could an architect usually really do in a place like this? And how would one associate with, say, people there, or the general political milieu that kind of exists in a region like this? So there were a couple of thoughts that kind of came to my head, and there are two things about architecture that I realized when I was traveling there, which usually not many people are very aware of. I'm not saying I'm a huge philosopher or, you know, I know a lot about architecture, but these are two things that kind of really stuck with me while I was traveling in Srinagar, and even after that, which I very compassionately believe in. One thing is that architects usually come with a sense of power, whether we like it or we don't. Because I think we always have a patron that we are catering to. We have a client who always kind of appoints us to make something for him, or we always associate with the state very easily, because we also get projects from the government, and the infrastructure that the government is kind of building, and the architects are almost required everywhere. So I think it's because of this association or this appointment of the architect by somebody who kind of has, say, economic power or social power in the society, that we also kind of associate with that sense of power. And when we enter a region like Kashmir, is when you realize that you actually have a lot of power in hand, which probably is detrimental for a region like this. So that's something that I kind of realized when I went to there. And the second is that architecture, and architects for that matter, come with a huge sense of social responsibility, because it is because of architects how cities are shaped, it is because of architects how people live, it is because of architects there are a lot of, say, physical built phenomenon is happening in the current world. And I think it's very important for us to realize that we have that social responsibility whenever we build, whenever we design. And those were two things that hit me very, very hard in a region like this in Kashmir, because firstly, it's also because of the exclusion that the people there kind of experience, that they always consider you an outsider. So they've become an exclusive community for who everybody that comes from the rest of the parts of India, who very readily associate themselves to the nation, are almost considered the outsiders, because we usually don't consider them a part of India as well. And for then the architect to kind of go and say that I want to do something there is extremely difficult. So I think one of the approaches that I thought would be would work in a region like this is to take up down-up approach, which is something where you understand how people live, understand the lives of people there, what they go through, what their daily lives are like, and only then would you be able to design a program or say an architectural intervention in a place like this. So I think that involved a lot of traveling, a lot of going to various places where people congregate, going to their prayer places, going to places where they celebrate, they protest, etc. So I think when I went to a lot of these places in the downtown of Srinagar, some of these places were the Khanka Maula Mosque, which is one of the oldest Sufi shrines in the region, a beautifully walnut wood crafted building, very, very old. But you realize that all of these places have a pattern that they follow, because they associate themselves very well to the Mughal style of architecture. That you always have a charbagh outside the main shrine, which is the building. Then you have the building, which is the main sanctum, and then you have a lot of other social spaces that are kind of around these buildings. So you will have yarbels, which is a regional word for ghats, where you will see a lot of kids playing, you will see a lot of women congregating. The sanctum, or like the shrine, like I call it, is a place where usually all the men kind of congregate and pray and discuss things, discuss politics, discuss life, discuss how they want to make their voices heard. And then the charbags, or like the kabutar khanas, the plinths where women are designated to kind of sit, is where they sit and gossip. Even you'd be surprised that even the women actually, these are the only spaces, the social spaces, that the women actually find their voices, because otherwise I'm sure we must have heard of stories where women in Kashmir are not the kind of, are not usually the ones that kind of come out and protest. We always see that front being male dominated. So even like the spaces like I spoke about, the charbags, became beautiful spaces for women to kind of come out and talk about all of these things that they usually would not sitting at home. So I think it were these examples that were within the whole region that I traveled through that gave me cues or say precedents to kind of work with in terms of the architectural development that I wanted to do in the design. And at the same time, while I was back in Bombay, I was also looking at a lot of different people, a lot of different artists, a lot of different cultural practices that have already established themselves in a region like that of Kashmir. So we have Nilima Sheikh, who is a very, very well-known artist in India, who paints these large scrolls about the sufferings of people in Kashmir, and the way she looks at herself and the political position that she takes when she works with people in Kashmir is that she gets artists from Kashmir to kind of collaborate with her to make those larger scrolls. So the scrolls are also beautifully kind of put together, where there's text from Kashmiri poets that goes up on the scroll. There's some sort of stencil work which is also very kind of evident throughout Kashmir, and then you have the local arts of like carving and stuff that are also kind of used in the painting. And in a way that she works, she almost becomes an economic provider for people that usually do not get opportunities in Kashmir because of the conflict, because you always are scared to kind of go and work there, because the first thing that you'll always think of is, I don't want to be associated with the conflict, I don't want to get in the middle of that. So I think what she does is incredible. And then you have Frenny Manekshaw, who also is a Mumbai-based journalist and author who extensively travels and talks to women in the region, and picks out like stories of how they've kind of gone through certain things when the conflict was at its peak in the region, and so many of them who've lost their sons and whose husbands have kind of disappeared and never returned, and then they've only found their dead bodies, and what sort of suffering do they have to go through, how much mental trauma that they have to go through. She very beautifully documents that into a book called Behold I Shine, which is completely a woman-centric book. And how, because we usually hear of men going through these things and men coming out and protesting, but she picks a very different audience from Kashmir that we usually don't know about. So I think even that kind of really helped me look at these various political positions. And then we have Sumit Dayal, who is born in Srinagar, then moves out to Nepal because of the conflict, and then he comes back as a photographer to find what his roots are with respect to the current scenario in Kashmir. So I think a lot of people have already started working in this, but we usually don't see architecture being one of those cultural practices that kind of does something in the region. And I think that is something that I saw as an opportunity of exploring, to see for oneself what architecture has a power to do, or what architecture can really do in a region like this. Because I think it's very important, like I said, the social responsibility that we have, that we do things that we like, but it's also our responsibility to do things in regions that we usually do not want to go and explore, because there are people that live there and need a voice. And I think the architect could become a way where they could kind of get their voice through the built form, because there's not much that an architect can do. I mean, I'm sure that architecture doesn't have the power of solving a social reality like this, but I'm very, very confident about the fact that architecture does have the power of making lives better for people that live in a region like this. So I think the first step after all of the research that was done, all of the visits that was done, was to actually think of what sort of program that we can put in a region like this that would make lives, daily lives, like I would say, of the people in Kashmir better. People that are usually innocent and like are living lives terribly because of the conflict. So I think one of the things that I decided to do was make a matrix. So I mean, I didn't want to be the judge of what program would be the best for them. So a matrix was the only way that would kind of help me in kind of shortlisting certain programs that would work in a region like this. So the matrix involved programs that I heard from people that they require when on my visits to Srinagar. There were certain programs that the officials from Srinagar, the officials with power, say from the government, had in mind from the proposals that they had made for certain parts in Srinagar. There were certain programs that on my visit that I thought could work in Srinagar. And all those programs are basically judged against certain parameters like the scale of the project, the scale of the built form, the sphere of influence of how many people within a community, within the whole region, within the whole city, or like a small little neighborhood that the program that I was inserting within the region would affect. And also who would fund this project at the end, because I mean thesis is a point where you're almost thinking of academics, but at the same time you're thinking about the feasibility and reality of such projects. So I think it was very important for me to think whether this project would actually get government acceptance and government funding, or would it be funded by, say, some of the powerful groups within Kashmir, or would it be somebody else, like a private company that would kind of come and fund a project like this. So I think all of these things then finally helped me come down to a couple of programs that I think, and also when I cross-checked them with people of Kashmir, thought that would actually work in a region like this. So one realizes that when there is a conflict in a region, there are certain things that suffer the most. People obviously is one of them, but the education sector, because education becomes very difficult to give to people in places of conflict. The second is the job sector, where the economic sector basically, because it's very difficult to generate economy in places of conflict, which is why a lot of people suffer. They lose their jobs, they have nothing to do, which is why they have to sit at home. And the medical sector, because in conflict, when you have so much violence and you have so many people kind of getting hurt and dying, it just becomes very difficult to provide that sort of medical help to people. And I'm not even talking about medical help physically, but also the mental health issues that people go through in a region like this. So I think these three were the main important headings of programs that I went ahead with, and I realized that economically I would not be able to do much, because architecture can generate very limited amount of wealth to kind of make the building run, but it would not usually kind of affect the economic status of the region so much. But I think the education and the medical facilities were something that I could really take up as programs for the thesis. So one program of interest for me was the school, one was a health center, one was a library, which was a large city program that kind of didn't exist in the whole of Kashmir, but also acted as an archive for whatever was happening in the region, because whatever we read or kind of go through about the conflict right now is only through media, and you know how deceiving media can be. So I mean it just became important for the people there to start archiving what was happening. So I think the library was seen as an opportunity to do that, and there were certain smaller programs that were imagined within the whole design, like the memorial, the amphitheater that became a large open space for people to congregate, and a couple of smaller pavilions that were left open-ended for people to kind of come and appropriate for themselves as to whatever program that they wanted to do in that space. So I think those became the program strategies for the program, and then the most important question at that point was to where to site the building.